Hello and welcome to 12 Questions, a podcast where we dissect anything and everything with the same incisive set of queries. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Paris.
And we're joined by a special guest this week, Charlie. How you doing, Charlie?
That's me. I'm doing all right. How are you, Jonny?
I'm really well, thank you, yeah. It's been a busy couple of days, but I'm keen to be back recording the podcast with you folks. And we've got a smashing film to be looking at this week. This week we're looking at Whiplash. Whiplash is a film released in 2014, directed by
Damien Chazelle.
Thank you very much, Paris. The film follows our protagonist, Andrew Neiman, a young jazz musician in New York City, and his relationship with his teacher, Terence Fletcher. Andrew is trying to be the best jazz drummer in New York, which basically means the world. But where will his obsession drive him, and how will his, shall we say, overbearing teacher, how will that go? Who knows?
And of course, there will be spoilers, as ever.
Yes.
So you have been warned.
Yes. This is a film we all love.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'd all recommend that you go out and see the film. It's not like there's any major twists. It's not like, suddenly one character is revealed to be a ghost or anything like that. So, I mean, the plot isn't the really strongest element of this, but go see it before listening to this if you haven't, or just, stay listening along for the ride. But yeah, great film. We'd recommend. But now that everyone who's listening is caught up on the film, shall we begin?
Yes. So, question one, as ever, who was your favourite character?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the film very strongly focuses on two characters.
Yeah.
And that's, as we mentioned, Andrew Neiman, the jazz student, and his teacher, Terence Fletcher. So Andrew is this young hotshot who, shows talent on the drums. He's just got into Sheffield College of Music, and his teacher takes a shine to him because he's got some talent and some potential. Throughout the film, we see that drive to be the best, that obsession to become one of the world's, not just great, but one of the greats, really take hold of him. And we see the lengths that he goes to really improve his playing. What do we think about Andrew?
Well, I think it's definitely interesting that Andrew appears in every scene of the film, which is quite a Damien Chazelle thing, because La La Land, every scene features Mia or Sebastian. So you do follow Andrew's journey very, very closely, which is definitely interesting.
So it's a very tight story. It's very focused on our protagonist.
Yeah, definitely.
And the other character, Fletcher. How do we feel about Andrew as a character? Do we like him? Will he be close to our favourite? Do we not like him? What elements about him do we identify with?
I feel like I don't really relate to him because I don't think I've ever been so passionate about something that I would cut off my entire the rest of my life to pursue that and to cause myself that much horrific sorrow. It's not that I've never been passionate about anything, it's just that's a lot.
Exactly, yeah.
And I don't, it's not something that resonates with me personally.
Yeah, because we see over the course of the film, Andrew starts to let the whole rest of his life slip away for his craft. He has a girlfriend for a little bit who he dumps because he says that she would only hold him back. Yeah. His relationship with his family goes out the window. Everything that's not drums goes out the window.
Andrew, in sort of my viewing of it, is definitely a cautionary tale.
Okay.
And I think that's the one thing that, obviously in this film, trying to depict the way that Andrew goes and tries to attain the success that he wants to attain and be one of the greats, like be his idol Buddy Rich. He ostracizes himself and isolates himself from everyone around him. And that's not a desirable thing.
No.
But as anyone who has ever tried to strive for something like that, especially in a competitive field, it's still kind of alluring and it's still kind of glorifying.
Okay.
And so you still sympathise with Andrew in a really sort of masochistic and twisted way.
Yeah.
It's still there and it's just undenying. It's just, it creeps up on you.
Yeah, so even though the film clearly paints that what he's doing is destructive, there's still, you kind of come away with it.
There's still a romanticism to it, I suppose.
Because Charlie, I remember you said as soon as we finished watching the film that you really wanted to go and play an instrument or start mastering something after that, which you might think is what it's telling you not to do.
Oh, definitely. It's telling you. The film is, in my mind, definitely telling you to go just chill for an hour, just talk to your friends, talk to your family. But
call your dad.
Yeah, exactly. Just have a nice chat, have some popcorn in the movies with your dad, and don't eat around the raisins.
Exactly, yeah.
But in my mind, it makes me want to just go home, just lock myself in the room and just play guitar for 16 hours straight until I'm as good as Andrew is at his drums.
Yeah, and we see that kind of really taking hold on... I mean, Andrew Neiman is played by Miles Teller. His face kind of tells the story for a lot of the film. His face is
also very doughy.
Well, yeah, it's a bit doughy, but
the poor man's Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Wow, yeah. But it's very expressive in the sense that you see real looks of genuine pain on his face when
yeah.
he's playing the drums. So he's really pushing himself up to and beyond his limits. You see that inner turmoil written all over him. And he starts out, I guess, very nervous.
Yeah.
What kind of arc does he go on?
I don't know, because I'd say he gets more confident, because in the end scene, he does step up to the same level as Fletcher, and he's like, I'll cue you in.
Yeah.
But then he very quickly loses that, and Fletcher basically, like, re-destroys him.
Okay.
So, I don't know.
Well, you mentioned the ending scene, and I think that's a really pivotal bit in the film. But I think to really talk about it, we've got to talk about what I think is going to be someone we've got a lot to say about, which is Fletcher. So
On to Fletcher we go.
Exactly.
Played by J.K. Simmons. Played wonderfully by
Yes.
J.K. Simmons, actually.
And I think we might argue necessarily by J.K. Simmons. I don't
Okay.
think there are many other actors that could step into that.
There's not many actors with as veiny as a forehead as J.K. Simmons
Yes.
that could pull off that role.
It does about half the acting, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Charlie, would you be able to give us a little summary of who Fletcher is, what his deal
So
is?
Terence Fletcher is orchestrating. There's a line in the film that I think kind of summarises Fletcher quite well, where he's talking about how any idiot with a stick could conduct an orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
But Terence Fletcher tries to put himself beyond that. He tries to orchestrate people in a way, how he says, that pushes people beyond what's expected of them. And in doing so, he has a lot of psychological tricks that he uses throughout the film that break people down.
Yeah.
And in doing so, he remolds them into people that are just insanely broken and twisted and not good people at all, but are incredible musicians.
Yes. So he's the idea of drive, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
He's driven trying to make people what he sees as the best. Or if they're not, then they can just quit and leave. He's an angry man.
Yeah, definitely. I'd say one thing about Fletcher is he has a very kind of theatrical stage presence. Like, whenever he enters a scene, he'll slam the doors open, he'll storm in, and the camera will be focused on his feet, and it's just very... You know, you could imagine him with a swishing cape, like a kind of panto villain, but not a panto villain, because it's a lot darker than that, I think. But he definitely has he's a very big presence in the film. Like, you can't take your eyes off him in the film, really.
Absolutely not. It's interesting. The director gave him the direction to be beyond human, is what he said. Like, Fletcher isn't so much a human character as a
monster.
Well, yeah, exactly.
He's a monster.
Yeah, so he throughout the film is always pushing Andrew Neiman to new heights, but as you said, Charlie, through various horrible psychological means.
He's also incredibly opportunistic.
Oh, yeah?
After finding out about the suicide of one of his former students, who he has pushed so far beyond what was expected to him, that it's led him to anxiety, depression, and finally suicide.
Yeah.
He uses the opportunity to then push his 3 drummers in his band, who he's using as incentive against one another to hone their skills. Pushes them for, I believe, 4 hours in the film.
Yes.
Until the point where they literally cannot stay awake. They've got sweat in their eyes and blood on their hands, and they have to clean the blood off the drum kit before they can then start their hour or 2 hour practice session.
Yeah. And then he's just insulting them the whole way through. So he's got a heck of a mouth on him, Terence
really
Fletcher.
does.
He's got some very creative insults. He's always got something incisive and specifically horrible to say about someone. So I don't know if we've got some good examples of that. But
Well, he does, near the beginning, he talks to Andrew in quite a friendly way and kind of gets his backstory off him. And Andrew is basically like, oh, my mum walked out on us when we were younger.
Yeah.
And then you think Fletcher's being nice when they're having this little heart-to-heart, and then the next thing you know, he's like, no wonder your mum walked out on you, you're a crap drummer, and that kind of thing. Like, he's very manipulative.
And whenever he's nice, so for most of the film, Fletcher is kind of on offensive mode. He's shouting, he's horrible, he's insulting people, he's trying to push people. But occasionally there are scenes where he's quote unquote nice, and the kind of marker for this is when he uses the word man. So when he's like, hey man, how you doing? You'll be fine, man. I think that's a marker of that kind of fake sincerity, because if you call someone man, it's because you've forgotten their name. It's like, hey dude, how are you?
How's it going?
Exactly. So whenever you hear him say that, it's that kind of falseness where he's just, he's putting on a show, but the reality of Fletcher is this kind of this charged, raging bull.
Equally as well, when he's like degrading his students, he can say things that the playground bully would say and people would laugh at.
Yeah.
But he's saying it with such conviction and in such a presence of authority that, like, when he's talking about one student who's just like an overweight student seeing a Mars bar on the floor, and that's why he can't look directly in his eyes.
Yes.
Even though it's because he's intimidating. Like that kind of stuff is like what the playground bully would say.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It
it's a
still
very, it's
comes
very
across.
juvenile insult,
Exactly.
but you're kind of chilled to the bone watching it. You're like, oh, that's really, ooh.
Yeah, and just as you said, Paris, earlier, he really is a monster.
He is. He's a monster.
And I think that, and we mentioned his forehead earlier, but I'd say that's really conveyed by the fact that J.K. Simmons is bald.
Okay, talk to us about that.
I think, honestly, I genuinely think that the fact that being bald is essential to this character. I don't think this character would work with, curly ginger hair or anything like that. And that's for two reasons. One, his head is all one colour, which we'll come to in a bit. Whenever he's lit, often they're inside because jazz music is played in concert halls and such, and all the artificial lights bounce straight off him. And the second is that his ears are very prominently on display, so there's no hair over his ears, and he's always listening. There's a scene near the start where someone in the band is out of tune, and he's kind of hunting for them. The band plays, and he says, "He's here." He goes through, I think it's the reeds, it's not in there, he goes through the
brass, I think.
Yeah, the brass. And he's hunting for this person that's out of tune, and he's always listening. He's always attentive, which means the band and by extension the audience are always on edge when he's there, because he's never relaxed.
Yeah.
So yeah, he looks a bit of a monster, a bit like one of those bald lab rats or something like that. But
Wow.
I mean, I'm not saying anyone that's bald can't be beautiful, certainly. But
I was going to say, bouncing off J.K. Simmons' bald head.
yeah.
What was your
Bouncing off his head.
What was your favourite colour that bounced off his bald head, Johnny?
Oh, very
question
nice.
two.
Next question. I think we'd all agree that this film has a very strong and sort of deliberate colour palette.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the film has a lot of colours which are very in obvious contrast to each other. So the big debates that we were having prior to the podcast were white to black and orange to blue.
Yeah.
Which seem to be constantly throughout
Yes,
these
definitely,
motifs.
What I saw of this is that there's two palettes that are in opposition.
Okay.
So the first is white and blue. That's kind of embodied in whenever something's naturally lit, whenever there's light coming through a window, it's kind of white and tinged a bit blue. And you see this a lot at the start, and I think that I think this is basically not so much innocence, but it represents Andrew's former life. Andrew wears a white shirt in the very first scene, and this white undershirt sticks with him through a lot of the film. And his father also wears a white undershirt, arguably the same shirt. And when you see members of Andrew, well, you're hoping not the same shirt. When you see members,
The family only has one shirt.
yeah, oh, it's a tough year. We have to share the shirt.
I mean, he's only a teacher. Come on.
Exactly, but
He's not Eugene O'Neill.
yeah, but and even it's not just the father. When you see them at a family get together, other members of the family wearing that white shirt. Throughout the film, Andrew is faced with this decision. If he just wants to be kind of okay and good enough, that's like his father, who is not quite a writer, is more of a school teacher. It's mediocrity, basically. And then you have the kind of dark and twisted palette of orange and black, which suits the jazz band very well. It's kind of gold, orange and black, which is kind of the colours of a band in a studio setting. The orange lighting, the black walls and floors, and the gold of the instruments. And this is what we were saying about Fletcher. Charlie, as you put it, bouncing off Fletcher's head is always lit in orange. It's a very claustrophobic colour palette. The contrast you mentioned is whenever you go from this kind of underground, these dark studio scenes out into a daylight scene, you kind of feel a release in that. Yeah, I'd say that Andrew's former life is blue and white, and the obsession with becoming one of the greats is orange and black.
Definitely coming off your point on blue, Nicole often wears blue clothes, and definitely wears blue clothes when she's on a date with Andrew, who's also wearing blue.
Well, who's Nicole?
Oh, Nicole is Andrew's potential girlfriend. They go on a few dates and then he breaks up with her because he's like, oh, I'm just gonna make you miserable with my obsession with jazz music. But yeah, they're on a date together and they're both wearing blue and it's quite a brightly lit area they're in. And that also contrasts with the scene exactly before that. Is he's drumming and he's bleeding a lot.
Yes.
So you have the blue and the red contrasting quite a bit there. And I think blue kind of represents his life outside of the jazz music, and you see definitely the end scene, there is no blue in it.
Yes.
So
certainly.
That's kind of the finality of that.
I think we read the orange versus blue in different ways. Because in my sort of viewing the film, I found orange to be, I guess, a more sort of traditional colour in terms of it to be sort of dealing with warmth and the idea of progression and moving towards something, like a literal moth drawn towards a flame.
Okay, yeah.
And I saw that where Nicole is first introduced, or at least the scene, the very awkward but endearing and cute scene.
Yeah, meet cute.
Yeah, it's nice. It's what all of our first experiences trying to ask someone out on a date probably would have gone like. On that scene, there is orange in the background.
Yeah.
And frequently, orange as a reoccurring motif in my mind in the background. It's in Fletcher's studio when Andrew first peers in the window really early on into the movie, and orange and red are on the colour of the Buddy Rich CD that Andrew looks up to and he admires. And there is a scene later in the film where Andrew loses the main drummer's folder and loses his sheet music, and therefore is allowed to take his position as the new core lead drummer in the jazz band. And all of those scenes are in orange, whereas I see blue often reoccurring around Fletcher, especially on his blue eyes.
That's certainly true.
Blue is in the background. It complements that very well. And so I see blue as something that creeps throughout the film, and it's something that gets more heavy towards the end.
Okay.
The only exception to that is in the last and final scene, where those colours switch.
Oh, yeah.
Fletcher is now in orange.
Yes.
And his dad is now in blue. And I think that's the film's way of signalling towards us at this point that he's just moving away from his family for the final time, and he just cannot settle with mediocrity.
Yeah.
He needs to move towards something, even as the audience we know, towards something that's more harmful, and something that we know is him sort of playing with fire when he moves towards Fletcher, who's now in orange towards the end.
And it's interesting you bring that up there, because in what you might call the inciting incident, when Fletcher asks Andrew to join his band for the first time, Andrew is half lit in orange on the right side and half lit in blue on the left side. So, yeah, I think you're right. That's those two forces kind of... Because that's the big decision. It's when he starts to be drawn left to right to that orange.
Would it be fair to say then that orange is the call to action?
Okay, yeah.
Throughout the film, when there's a call to action, it's orange. But in the nature of the film, not being part of the hero's journey, but more being actually a tragedy, blue is one that encompasses as the film progresses.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think you definitely summed it up pretty well with the moth to the flame thing.
Yeah.
That, I suppose that is Andrew's character arc. We were talking about his character arc earlier. His character arc is that he's the moth to the flame because he's drawn inexplicably to this thing that is going to absolutely destroy him, but he really wants it.
Well,
it's my psychoanalysis of a moth.
One just last point on colour that I'd like to make is in the wardrobe choice.
Okay.
So Fletcher almost always wears black. That's his, that's his style. He's always wearing a black jacket and or a black shirt. And Andrew, as we said, starts the film wearing white, but his wardrobe slowly darkens. So in Andrew's first rehearsal with Fletcher, when he's kind of new and innocent, he's wearing his white shirt. In his second rehearsal with Fletcher, it's a dark blue shirt. And in the third rehearsal, he's wearing a black shirt. And interestingly, his first wearing of a black shirt comes after this sort of scene with his family where he basically acts like a real tit. he's being sarcastic.
He isolates himself.
Exactly, yeah, that's absolutely it.
More words you will never hear from the NFL.
Exactly. So he's starting to embody those characteristics of Fletcher of being, nasty to people and not tolerating anything less than the best. And immediately after that scene, you see him wearing the black shirt for the first time. Towards the end of the film, there's a moment, maybe his last moment of potential salvation from this orange obsession, which is when he calls up Nicole, the girl who he briefly had a thing with. And, it's him reaching out. One of the very few times he's reaching out in the film, he asks her to go to the concert, and he's wearing his white shirt. But she turns him down, and we never see the white shirt again. We move into the last scene, which is his black shirt.
That scene with Nicole is also in orange in the background.
Yes, certainly. So, as we said, very deliberate colour palette for the film. So, anything else on colour? Let's not forget to answer the question what our favourite colour is.
Oh, yeah. Good point. This is 12 questions after all. Does Fletcher ever wear white? Does he wear it in that scene where he's pretending to be nice?
He wears lighter colours, not white per se. I did know he plays the piano though. If you want an instrument to have a white colouring in it, it's the piano. It's the only instrument in the jazz. Well, yeah, that's true.
It's white on top of black.
Oh, yeah.
No, black on top of white.
Well, it's your perspective, really. But of all the instruments in the jazz band, the piano is the only one with any white in it. So when you see Fletcher outside of his jazz band environment in a very rare scene, he is wearing lighter colours and playing the piano.
So What were your favourite colours?
I guess a non-answer is black in the film, because on the contrast of white and black throughout the film is like very obvious from a storytelling perspective of just the protagonist and the antagonist going against each other and the contrast of those two. But I also feel like the fact that black is such a non-colour, the fact that it's so empty and void, I think personifies Fletcher quite a lot.
Absolutely.
And what he tries to do to people. He just break people down to the point where they are complete shells and complete husks. And the fact that Miles Teller's character starts to wear black and starts to embody that, I think just shows the downward spiral that he's on, the trajectory that he's on.
Similarly, I think it kind of represents the sort of merging of the two characters by the end of it, because by the end of it, they're both setting the tempo in a song, and they're both, like, very intensely into what they're doing, and they're both wearing black. So I suppose it's kind of Miles Teller's character wearing black kind of represents him converging into Fletcher's world, I guess. He's getting sucked into this world. So yeah, I think black is my favourite colour for that kind of reason.
Hoping in the sequel that Miles Teller's character will be bold. It will be Fletcher.
Oh, nice.
A really veiny forehead.
First thing, I take the other end of the wheel. I go for white. Is my favourite colour. But kind of for the same dichotomy reasons that we mentioned. I will actually bring up, this is a bit of a stretch, white even goes so far as to teeth.
Okay.
So, as we mentioned, Nicole, this character that Neiman has a brief relationship with, is completely detached from the jazz world. And she is that hope and that other life outside. And she has this brilliant toothy smile. And she's got great teeth, very white teeth. Miles Teller, and this might just be how this actor does things, but he doesn't smile with his teeth all that often. When he does smile, which isn't that often. Yeah. J.K. Simmons only smiles with his teeth when he's being fake. Yeah. He's a bit like a shark in that way. And in fact, if you look at him, a bit like what you were saying about him embodying black, Charlie, is that when you look at his mouth throughout the film, you don't see his teeth. It's black. It's his black void. So
there is also one scene right at the very end, in the last sort of 10 seconds of the film, where he does a genuine smile and his mouth is completely cut.
Exactly, yes. So I think that this film's colour palette of black and white even extends to the dentures of the film as to when you do and don't see teeth. So I think that's interesting, so I'm going to pick white. But we're all basically, looking to the same idea. Right, shall we move on to our next question?
Yep, question 3. What was your favourite meeting?
Oh boy.
I would actually quite like to start this one, because
this.
one of my favourite meetings is right at the beginning. So Andrew meets Fletcher, and Fletcher decides he's good enough for the studio band and invites him to come to practice at 6 a.m. on whatever day, let's say Monday. And you next see Andrew wake up, his clock says 6:03, he's like, oh no, gotta run. He runs all the way to practice, and then he's running down the stairs to the practice room, and he falls over. So the meeting I refer to is the meeting of Andrew and the floor. Because, and hear me out on this one, because it's like he hasn't even been to his first rehearsal yet and he's already hurting himself for this. Like, he's already causing himself some degree of physical pain, which I think is very good foreshadowing for the entire film, because it just escalates and escalates from there. Like, this is just a small trip on the floor. Yeah. It gets worse and it doesn't stop getting even more intense in that sense. So that's why I like that meeting, as it sets that up.
So from the very first scene of the film, Andrew is immediately conditioned by Fletcher, and I think this is why the escalation in the film happens very smoothly from the audience's perspective. The escalation starts with verbal abuse and neglect from Fletcher, and then when it escalates into sort of physical pain, where Andrew is tripped down a flight of stairs, smashed his face, and just will carry on, it seems like the next natural progression is for Fletcher to become even more domineering. And this happens when Andrew makes seemingly a mistake after just being praised by Fletcher in a rehearsal. And Fletcher slaps him to the time of the piece that he could not get. And I found it really interesting that Andrew's instinctive reaction is to carry on counting even though he's being repeatedly hit in the face. Because we'd all stop.
I would.
Stop and be like, what, I'd probably leave. What the hell are you doing? Leave, report this man to the uni and never come back again. I'd move on to jazz. I'd start a rap album or something. Him. But he instinctively carries on. He's just completely been conditioned even before the main events of this film even start.
Charlie, you referred to it earlier as a yes ladder, this sort of sequence of conditioning, getting this escalation.
It's the equivalent of when your university calls you after you finish and asks you, is this John Smith? And you say, yes, this is John Smith. Did you go to this university? Yes. and they'll repeatedly build the questions and they'll build the intensity. It's a very slow boil.
Like boiling a frog.
Yeah.
It is like boiling a frog.
So they're getting you to like concede bits and bits and bits. So like you keep saying yes to, you know, things that require more and more commitment, I suppose. And like, that's what you say Fletcher is doing in this. So that Andrew's face hitting the floor is the first yes.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
The first bit of
The beginning
pain.
of the boil.
Wow, yes, absolutely. The flame starts to heat up. Charlie, what's your favourite meeting in this piece?
I'm going to have to really think about this. There are so many good early, like Paris said, in Act 1 of the film, these preliminary meetings that set up the entire film. So those scenes that happen in very quick fire, Andrew meeting Fletcher for the very first time, and the neglect and the kind of drive that he shows. There's the scene where Andrew is at the movies with his dad, and you're given immediately the contrast between the two of them. The contrast of being an average man. His father is a teacher and is very proud of his profession, proud of being Teacher of the Year, but Andrew sees that as beneath him.
Yep.
There is meetings with Andrew and his love interest, Nicole, that, like we said, is very warm, but is also very awkward and very, very cringy, but also very endearing. It's one of the only moments of hope in a really bleak film. And so you have to love it for that reason. But I don't know how to pick a favourite meeting in this film. There are so many standout moments that I just really struggle.
That's an absolutely fair answer.
Johnny, what's your favourite meeting?
Well, my favourite meeting is a little bit more thematic, and that's the meeting of the first and the last scene. I think they bookend the narrative in quite a circular way.
Yeah, definitely.
So just to give some context, and we've touched on it before, the first scene is Andrew is practicing the drums and he meets Fletcher. And then Fletcher asks him to do some double time swing to his tempo, but Andrew doesn't impress. And Fletcher walks away. And then he comes back, but he's forgotten his coat. In the final scene, and we've alluded to this before, it's a performance at Carnegie Hall. So we've gone from a small rehearsal room in Schaefer to the big leagues. You know, this is it. Andrew is here at Carnegie Hall with Fletcher, and this is his moment. And it turns out that in classic Fletcher style, it was a complete setup. Fletcher has only invited Andrew there to humiliate him in front of the biggest possible audience and ruin his career. And he does. Andrew has to play along to a song that he doesn't have the chance to, and it all goes awry. But the final moment of that scene is Andrew coming back. He comes back onto the stage, and well, for a moment he has this glorious moment where you think he reverses the whole tempo of the film. For the whole film, Fletcher's been taking the time, would you say?
Fletcher has this quite iconic line of "not quite my tempo," and it's used very deliberately to, especially for the drummers, to break them down.
Yeah.
And there's loads of references in the film of reoccurring themes about wait for my cue, about him literally grabbing a cowbell to Andrew's head and beating it incessantly.
Yeah. So, but the whole film is to Fletcher's time. He conducts the orchestra, and then even the camera edits are to the music, which Fletcher is deciding the tempo of. And then for this glorious moment in the final scene, it's on Andrew's time. Andrew kicks in with the drums, and they're essentially following him. And so in any other film, you might end it there. You might have this lovely reversal. But actually, what happens is Andrew is playing the drums, and then Fletcher walks over to him and starts directing him. And then you see, you've had this, lovely this shimmering moment, and then you see once again Fletcher taking back the time. And what really brings that in is the motif of the drums kind of slowing down to just a snare going ba 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 ba, and then Fletcher brings it up, and you hear that ba 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 ba, which you hear,
which is present in both scenes.
Exactly, it's the first thing you hear in the film, and then it's one of the last things you hear in the film, and that's it really brings home the kind of circle that Andrew. I mean, he's a better player now, but he's still in Fletcher's thrall by the end of it. Fletcher is still running things. He still has the tempo.
The symbolism of this, I think, is quite mapped out strongly with the Charlie Parker versus Jones narrative that's throughout the whole film.
Yeah.
So Charlie Parker is quite a famous jazz musician that I have not listened to, so I'm going to spitball this as best as possible.
He's really, really good.
He probably is. I'll go home and listen to him after this. In Whiplash, Charlie Parker's story is told from the perspective of where he is a young, up-and-coming jazz musician. And is it Joe Jones?
Yeah.
And Joe Jones throws a cymbal at Charlie Parker's head. And that incident of that cymbal being thrown is used as symbolism throughout the entire film, especially when Fletcher throws a chair at Andrew's head minutes after telling him that specific story.
Yes.
But where that turn happens, where that story mapped onto the final scene, should be Andrew becoming his own Charlie Parker.
Yeah.
As Fletcher says, Andrew coming back and playing the best solo that he ever gives in his life.
Absolutely.
However, Fletcher also specifically references Charlie Parker and his own journey as a teacher as having my Charlie Parker.
Yes.
It's a very possessive point. And that final scene of him redirecting Andrew is showing that even though he's become the new Charlie Parker, he is still Fletcher's. He's still possessed by this man who wants nothing but for him to just shit out perfect 400s. Like
Yes.
he says.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in answer to your question, Paris, my favourite meeting is that symbolism and that circular narrative between the first and last scene. Fletcher truly dominates the film in tempo.
Well, yeah, I think that's a wonderful meeting. So the next question
Yes.
is, how would your nan react to this?
Oh, how would our nans react to this? Paris, you've always got something to say about your nan.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to go down the really obvious route here and be like, my nan would just be horrified by this film.
Yes.
There is a lot of swearing,
There is,
which
yes.
she would not be down for.
Do you think that your nan would like the line where Fletcher threatens to fuck Andrew like a pig?
I don't think she would like that line. I think she would tut at it.
Well, I don't even think J.K.
Very
Simmons
strongly.
liked that line, did he?
Oh yeah, actually, J.K. Simmons refused to say that line. What he actually says is, I will fucking gut you like a pig. And they had to edit it. So to cut that down to the actual line in the end. But yeah, so my nan would dislike the swearing, and I think she would just dislike how violent it is. And, you know, maybe she'd go into it expecting some nice little jazz music, and then that happens and she'd be horrified.
Okay.
Does anyone else have a different take on that?
So there's a very telling scene towards the tail end of the film where after Fletcher has been dismissed from Schaefer and Andrew has been dismissed from Schaefer also, they talk things out in a jazz bar. And in that scene, Fletcher talks about how if he does not push people beyond what's expected of them, then the world would have no more Charlie Parkers. And that kind of idea of pushing people beyond what's expected of them, and the idea that this is a dying art, like he says with every Starbucks jazz album, I think is something a nan could get behind.
Okay.
I think a nan would see something like that and have it connotated to the idea of like safe spaces and protecting this generation and us being mollycoddled, entitled millennials.
All right.
I think, not to get too political with that, not to read into it too much, but I think it could go down that rabbit hole.
So someone of an older generation might appreciate the value of hard work, you might say. Also, of pushing someone and not, as you say, being very sensitive about it. So you could see how a certain nan might... Do you think they'd like it, though? Do you think that would be enough for a nan to enjoy this film? Would a nan side with Fletcher?
I think a nan could see Fletcher's side of the point. I think they could definitely see, and especially with modern music, because if you can digitally enhance someone's voice through auto-tune, if you can play things digitally, then that means that there's less human qualities to it.
Yeah.
And that means that the person playing that does not have to be perfect, or they don't even have to be technically skillful in the sense that they don't have to be able to repeatedly play the same thing over and over again. And I think a nan would see that and see the hard work that comes with that as something that's being lost in kind of today's society.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I can certainly see that. I'm a bit undecided on the issue, so I guess as always it depends on the nan. We could certainly see how a nan might react poorly to it based on the violence and the abhorrent nature of some characters in the film, or maybe would actually identify with what Fletcher is trying to go for. Well then, one for your nan to consider at her own pace.
Nan discretion advised, as always.
I think you should both try and get your nan to watch Whiplash at some point and maybe document the results.
That's not happening. I'm not going to do that. Question 5.
Yes, what food would this be? If you had to describe this as a food, what would it be?
Well, there's always the fact that it seems quite because you might go into it and think, oh, this is going to be a story of a guy that learns how to become a really good drummer. This is going to be, you're expecting this to be like a story with a happy ending, because I feel like a lot of films you expect to have some kind of resolved ending. So, you've got a sweet exterior to it, but then what's inside is a bit of a surprise.
Yes, certainly.
You weren't expecting it. It's the ending has no resolution. It's, it's unexpected. So perhaps it is a Brussels sprout covered in chocolate disguised as a Ferrero Rocher.
Whoa, okay.
That's my take
Very
on
textured.
this.
Okay, so you bite into it. You think it's one thing. Andrew thinks his jazz career is going to be like this, and he really bites into it, and it turns out
It's a Brussels sprout.
yeah, it's a lot sour, or a lot, not as nice as he might have expected. Okay.
The only way I could add to that is that the film will be a Brussels sprout disguised as Ferrero Rocher, and you bite into it and hate it at first, but then sort of realise you like it too much.
Yeah,
to
I
stop.
quite like
Alright.
Brussels sprouts.
Yeah.
I haven't tried them covered in chocolate, but I do quite like Brussels sprouts.
Well, you say you have to try something 5 or 10 times and you end up liking it. It might be like that.
You have to climb the yes ladder.
Well, exactly. Your first chocolate Brussels sprout might be horrible, but if you're forced to eat 10 of them, maybe that's, that becomes what you eat. I might also put forward the case that this could be a gobstopper.
Okay.
So like a really hard gobstopper that takes, 1,000 or 10,000 licks to get to the centre of. Because it's like that 10,000 hours thing to get really good at something. Many people might, discard the gobstopper after a little bit of time, but Andrew ends up being committed to, seeing it through, I suppose. And
he strives through all of the jaw ache.
well, yeah, exactly.
And in the end, it rots his teeth.
Wow, yeah, absolutely.
Or makes his hands bleed.
Yeah,
Why he
More
never
literal
smiles.
sense.
Yeah, that's why you never see his teeth.
This is it. This is where Miles Teller's teeth went.
Yeah, so that challenge of getting through the gobstopper and the endurance and perhaps the unhealthy side effects that might come from just eating a whole bowl of sugar, I'd say could also be representative of this film. So that's quite the meal to have, is chocolate-covered Ferrero Rocher Brussels sprouts with a side dessert and homework of a gobstopper. But hey, we never said that this film would be an easy experience.
Certainly not.
Which brings us on to our next question.
Which is our favourite to dramatically exclaim,
Certainly.
of course. Question 6. Why would you do that?
How would you do that?
Why would you do that?
The question we ask every week to expose perhaps some of the foibles in the works that we look at, or perhaps something that we're really just not sure about, something that we're kind of mulling around in our heads. So why would you do that for Whiplash? Any suggestions, guys?
Well, one thing that I think Charlie pointed out when we were watching it, is that the time between him quitting drumming, essentially, or we assume so, at least, and him going back on the stage at the end, is a fair few months, and he's still, he's on it. Like, is that how it works? I don't play the drums, I don't know. Is it
He
like
still
riding a
must be
bike and you never
practicing.
forget?
Yeah.
Like, he still must be practicing in the background. He still must be trying to get there.
Is he though? Because he had such a bad experience with it. Would you not want to disassociate yourself entirely?
Possibly. If you're at a level... Because he's above grade 8, surely. So, like...
Incisive.
I don't think grade 8 is a meaningful concept at the level that he is
But
at.
what I mean is, like, if he's at that level, like, especially classically trained, like, you can read and work
Yeah.
around with citation,
Okay,
not
yeah.
just someone who learns by experience.
Yeah.
You must be able to just pick it straight back up.
Yeah, well, I guess there's aptitude and there's skill. It's like running, for example, because drumming is one of the most physical instruments. If you stop running for several months and then you go back on the track, you'll get good faster than someone who wasn't good before, but you'll still be a bit rusty, I think. But hey, maybe that's just how good Neiman is.
Maybe he's just really good.
Maybe he never forgets.
I would like to also propose a why would you do that?
Well,
Yeah,
go for
please.
I'd just like to ask, why would you do that to Andrew Neiman? Mainly for every choice he makes in the film.
Oh, right, okay. right in
And
there.
also, just why would you want to be? Because his central struggle is someone who wants to be great.
Yes.
He wants to be one of the greats.
Absolutely, yeah.
And when Nicole says to him, what is wrong with you, when they do break up, Andrew's reasoning is to be great.
Yeah.
And why would you aspire to be that great if single-mindedly you're heading towards one goal? Why would you want that one goal to shatter everything in your life? Why would you want to be that great? I ask that at the same time as I find that slightly endearing and alluring, that idea of being so good at something that it is the thing you do and that is your character.
So now you're asking yourself why you would be inclined to do that.
I'm going
This
down.
just got deep.
I'm going down a dark rabbit hole in this podcast.
Well, I definitely think that's worth exploring. That essentially it boils down to, is there any merit to what Fletcher is doing? Is it worth pushing yourself beyond those such extreme limits if the reward is achieving something new or something great? It's like, as Andrew says, would you rather die broke at 35 but people remember your name forever, or sober and rich at 91 but you're completely forgotten?
Well, it kind of goes back to what Charlie said about it being a cautionary tale.
Yes.
Because, yeah, he does destroy everything in his life for this one goal. And maybe if you're watching it and you're wondering, why would you do that? It kind of wakes you up to maybe your own hidden obsession, and you think, oh, maybe I should step back and think about the other things in my life and make sure that this one thing doesn't drive me to ruin, essentially. Sure. So, yeah, maybe, I mean, why would he do that as an actual character? That's another question, but why this film has made that the case, it's a cautionary tale. The
case the film makes as well, it's, I think after you see the final scene, you're supposed to reel in horror and go and, like, call your parents and have a chat and take the dog for a walk and just enjoy being normal and enjoy not being so self-obsessed. Yeah. But there's quite a large part of me that when I see the end of that film wants to go and, like I said, pick up my guitar and lock myself in a room for 16 hours straight until I can play as good as Andrew can. Yeah. It's this kind of nature that you could call it perfectionist if you were being lenient with it, but it's obsessive in its worst possible form. Yeah.
That's very interesting, because that's basically the opposite of what you were saying, Paris. That instead of seeing this film and thinking, oh, maybe I should keep this obsession in check, you see this film and you think, oh, maybe I should get obsessed with something.
I think so.
Maybe I should get really good at it. Do you think that's an unintentional effect of the film, or do you think that is actually what the film is trying to say?
It's trying to be a cautionary tale, but I think in doing that ends up glorifying the thing that it's trying to warn against. And I know that the director based the film off his own experience with a particularly scolding teacher.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think in that sense, he's obviously coming at it from his own perspective of like, thank God I got out of this toxic relationship. But the really clever point about this film is it takes it a step further, where you realise in the toxicity of this relationship, Andrew thrives and dies within it.
Yes.
Because he can't get out or doesn't want to get out. And slowly but surely his mentality is twisted to the point where it's what he wants and what he needs. And it's really fucked.
Well, yeah, certainly.
I suppose the fact that you kind of watch it and you're like, I want to go play guitar for 16 hours straight is the unintentional side effect. But that does naturally come out of the fact that this film isn't exactly unrealistic. Like, you could see this happening, and it does tap into a part of human nature that is inclined that way. So I suppose that's why it kind of ends up, like, people can resonate with it, because there is a potential to be obsessed in everyone, really, I suppose.
I guess the question to ask in kind of determining why Andrew goes down this path and looking at this dynamic of whether the obsession is justified is, I guess, is Fletcher proved right in this film? At the end of the film, you see how good Andrew's become at the drums. Is that, you know, kind of vindication for Fletcher's horrible teaching methods? Is that okay, yeah?
But then I don't know, because, I mean, I don't think anything justifies being that horrible. Okay. But in Fletcher's own mind, he's right, because he says, all I want to do is push people to be great. And Andrew is great by the end of it.
Yeah.
So whether you agree with the method, the outcome is what was intended.
As well, though, Andrew can walk away at any time. Fletcher is an extreme monster.
Yeah.
Borderline, most likely sociopath.
Yeah,
that
definitely
is incredibly charming on the surface, but once you're in his den, just breaks you down.
Yeah.
But Andrew can leave at any single time.
Yeah.
He's not instructed or required to be in Fletcher's sight. He actively seeks Fletcher out.
Yeah.
So no matter how extreme Fletcher is, Andrew is allowing this to happen.
So for me personally, Fletcher's approach is sort of like survival of the fittest. You know, his other drummers drop out because they don't have it. And he's questioned as to whether this would push people away, but his rationale is the next great jazz musician wouldn't be deterred. You know, they wouldn't be pushed away. But I think that's kind of personally, I think that's a backwards way of looking at it. If he thinks that if someone inherently has greatness, they'll shine, you know, they won't be deterred. I think this pushing approach is unnecessary. I think it drives people to ruin, essentially. His previous student, for example, is mentioned to have committed suicide in the film, and then the fact that Charlie Parker died at 35 is mentioned. And you wonder how much more these people could have given to the world if they'd lived longer. But they didn't, because of the destructive patterns of their lives, which Fletcher only encourages. So, I don't know, personally, I don't think he's justified.
No, neither do I, realistically, because nothing justifies such abuse, but I think he's definitely justified in his own mind.
Absolutely. So, moving on to our next question, question 7. What is the historical significance of this work? And I'm going to defer immediately to our resident historian. Paris, you got any thoughts?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I spent a whole semester last year doing a research essay on jazz music in post-war Germany.
Oh boy.
So I have some notes. notes.
Hit us with your notes,
I
Paris.
have some notes. Well, there was a big debate in post-war Germany about whether jazz music is inherently totalitarian or not, and therefore its relationship with the Nazi past.
Okay.
So there was a big debate where one side of the debate was essentially that jazz is... Well, there was a guy that said moments of deviation in jazz serve conformism. I mean, that sounds stupid to me.
Yeah, how does that work?
And actually, Eric Hobsbawm did say that the guy who said that wrote some of the stupidest pages ever written about jazz. But the point is that that was still an argument that was made at the time. And there was the argument that jazz was something of mass hypnotism and it encouraged fanaticism and mass enthusiasm among youth. And there's a quote from a newspaper at the time which ponders what kind of recklessness mass intoxication like the orgies of jazz fans might lead to if only the relevant motives are inserted. So there's this argument that jazz becomes an obsession, much like in Whiplash, and that it can sort of mobilise a large group of people to a certain ideology. So there's that argument that therefore jazz is essentially a vehicle for totalitarianism, which is kind of strange. The counter argument to that, of course, was that there's an individualism to jazz which is incompatible with dictatorship. So bringing that back to Whiplash, of course, is that I'd say Fletcher is quite perhaps anti-individualist because he doesn't really want Andrew to be an individual. He wants Andrew to be his.
Yes.
So he doesn't quite respect the individualism of jazz in that sense, and he is definitely a dictator.
Yes.
We can't deny that. And there is a sort of mass hypnotism under Fletcher because everyone is very much focused on being good for his sake.
Yes.
And being in his band. So there's definitely that element of it, and whether jazz in Whiplash is totalitarian. Whether or not it is, in general, is a whole other historical debate, which we won't go into.
So this totalitarian aspect to jazz is nothing new?
No, it's an argument that's been had since the 40s.
Wow.
There's also, being post-war Germany, you have East and West. So West Germany would use the fact that it had basically imported jazz from America as a propagandistic weapon against East Germany, and this idea that the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet states had very strictly controlled music, kind of strict tonal control, and jazz, therefore, in West Germany represented democracy because there's a freedom to it. Jazz is about improvisation and whatnot, whereas in Whiplash, there isn't a lot of room for improvisation when Fletcher is telling you what to do.
Yes.
So it's kind of ironic that jazz was a symbol of Western democracy in this historical context, but in Whiplash it's completely the other way around. There's nothing democratic about jazz in Whiplash. It is a dictatorship.
Yes.
So I feel like Whiplash kind of leans to the side of the people that say jazz is inherently totalitarian.
Okay.
So yeah, it's interesting because I was never convinced by the argument that jazz is inherently totalitarian, and I'd say Whiplash really turns that on its head and brings another perspective to it.
I mean, that's why it's not the traditional portrayal of jazz you see. It's,
exactly, and that makes me wonder, is seeing this as a film about jazz kind of missing the point?
Okay.
Because some critics have said that, I mean, somebody referred to this film as distorted jazz history, and I guess that makes sense because, I mean, this isn't a history of jazz. This isn't really about jazz. I mean, obviously it is about jazz, but
yes.
I'd say the jazz music is a vehicle for a psychological thriller, rather than it being a film about, oh, this is really nice music.
Yes, the film's really about the relationship between those two characters.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Which is probably why it has such a distortion on jazz in a historical sense.
Well, speaking of distortion of jazz, you certainly distort jazz and indeed the timeline if you were to get into our big purple time machine and give this to someone in history. So that brings us on to our next question. Who in history would you give this to if you had the option? If you go anywhere, forward or backward, who in history?
I think it's a film that everyone really should see.
Oh, wow. So you'd give it to literally everyone.
I give Whiplash to every single person
Why is
who
that?
has ever existed.
Okay.
I would do so, and ever will exist.
Oh, right, okay.
You can all inherit a copy of Whiplash under my socialism of Whiplash policy.
Okay, why is that?
Because I think it speaks to something very true and innate in people about how much time we dedicate towards specific things and how dark the path of obsession can get and how it is okay to settle for mediocrity. Because I think that is what the point of the film is trying to get at, that in reality it's okay to be mediocre because being mediocre or being average comes with it a whole bunch of positive attributes. you get to have a social life.
Yes.
You get to have other hobbies. You get to be known for other things. And obsession, although you can become great and become timeless in being great, and you can be known throughout history, the sacrifice that goes with it is massive. And it reminds me of every king or ruler or great person throughout history that has become so self-obsessed that they end up destroying their kingdom or their legacy or the thing that they were striving to achieve in the process of going down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, so you might say, I guess this lends itself to a wider historical point, saying that history is the stories of great people is false. That actually it's the amalgamation of stories of mediocre people. So that drive to be great is kind of a false target. That actually that's not what makes history, and that's not what changes things. What changes things is people living normally. Right, so everyone in history is who we would give
especially rulers that were obsessive.
Rulers. Yes, to hopefully show them, well, it's a tricky one, to show them the perils of that obsession. Maybe we cut it off, we just give the film up until, Andrew is at his lowest point, and then leave it at that. So, so they wouldn't get the wrong idea.
Selectively edit this.
And be validated. All right, okay. So looking back into the past, we must also ask ourselves about this piece of work. When will it be forgotten? Charlie, when do you think this film will be forgotten?
Possibly soon.
Okay.
However, I hope not.
No, of course not.
The film itself grossed pretty low in terms of the box office and is kind of overshadowed, I think Paris was saying earlier, is kind of overshadowed by like La La Land and other...
By the same director,
other films that are more sort of traditional, that are still quite akin to the same themes that are around.
You say it was quite low grossing, but it was one of the lowest grossing films to ever be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Picture. So credit where it's due on that. In terms of critical acclaim, it probably won't be forgotten as soon as it would be in public memory. But I don't know how significant that really is.
Yeah. And also credit for the fact that it was made on a $3 million budget.
In 19 days. Well, it was filmed in 19 days.
If anyone's seen The Room, that was made on a $6 million budget. Exactly. So compare it.
Oh my word. Yeah, when you put it into perspective like that, that's impressive. Well, that's a question. What do you think will be remembered longer, this or Tommy Wiseau's The Room?
Oh god, definitely The Room, because it's being a film made about The Room.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's no making of Whiplash that's in cinema.
Oh, no.
Well, I think an interesting question we have to consider that's kind of linked to this film is, when will jazz be forgotten?
Well, yeah, I definitely think there's the fact that Whiplash is tied to jazz music, kind of like how in our last episode we talked about how the Arctic Monkeys album is tied to sort of Sheffield nightlife. It's kind of, it will be remembered within that. And jazz being forgotten, I don't think anytime soon. I mean...
I don't know, because in this film, Schaefer says that jazz is dying, and then in the director's next work, La La Land, Ryan Gosling's character says that jazz is dying.
Yeah, maybe Damien Chazelle will just magically rebirth jazz.
I mean...
no, maybe not.
Realistically the saviour that jazz needs.
Yeah.
But, I mean, are these characters right? Do we think that jazz, doesn't seem to have the cultural impact that it once had back in the 40s? There aren't any fanatic jazz orgies that I've been invited to. So... perhaps
you're in the wrong social circles, mate.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, if I were president of the University of Sheffield Swing Dance Society, that's how you get all the invites to such jazz-related things.
And all the jazz orgies happen to the double time swing.
Yes, that's the code word.
But then there's also, as we've discussed quite heavily, the question of the sort of psychology of the film, because this is a psychological thriller.
Yes.
I mean, the human experience of wanting to be great at something is never going to go away. So the question is whether it's tied itself to that, has it tied itself to that as the most iconic representation of this concept? Perhaps not. I don't know. I mean, I want this film to be remembered for a long time because, like Charlie says, it's wonderful and everyone should see it. But maybe it will be forgotten.
I guess on a practical near-term level, it gave a real shot in the arm to the two actors who are performing in it, so Miles Teller and J.K. Simmons. This is probably one of their most acclaimed roles either ever, or at least in a long time. And Hollywood seems determined to put Miles Teller in things, despite the fact that I don't really enjoy watching him in anything apart from Whiplash. So I still remember this film because I strongly associate it with him, with Andrew Neiman's character. So as long as Hollywood keeps trying to make Miles Teller into a bankable star, I will remember this film. But that is, unfortunately, a near-term solution.
So speaking of things we don't really enjoy watching...
Oh, my word.
The news these days,
gosh.
because the question on everybody's lips that we must ask ourselves daily, and we put it on the podcast for that reason... What is this to do with Brexit?
Oh boy, what has this got to do with Brexit? Well, right off the bat, it's a film about a relationship.
Okay.
So, are there any analogies or comparisons we could draw between the British relationship with the European Union and Andrew's relationship with Fletcher?
There is one quite telling scene where Andrew is sat with his family in a room having dinner.
Yes.
Maybe you could hazard as having a negotiation.
Oh, right, okay. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, Andrew in this scene particularly isolates himself
Yes.
by thinking he's above and better than everyone else.
Okay.
And it seems like as a country we've just sort of done the same thing.
All right, okay, so Andrew is the United Kingdom in this analogy. And I guess that brings it back to the whole question of that we were saying around the film is that is an initially self-destructive series of decisions that leads to Andrew becoming greater or a much better jazz musician. Is that what people might want to think of Britain's decisions regarding the EU?
Well, I think it's definitely the case that he isolates himself with the aim of becoming greater. And I think that is a fairly obvious reason that people voted to leave the EU, because obviously it is isolating yourself from a union, literally, and the idea was that it would be better for the country to do that. So, yeah, in a very obvious surface level, this film is about isolating yourself to be better on your own. It's about independence.
All right.
There's a broader idea as well about sort of breaking yourself down before building yourself back up that I think.
Yes.
If the pound dropped 30 points after a night, you might say we had to break ourselves first and hopefully we'll come up stronger as a result of that.
So, well, depending on your take on the film, this may be either an optimistic message about leaving the European Union, which would be that despite initial problems, just like Andrew Neiman, you'll come out stronger and more talented afterwards. But perhaps, as we were saying, it's actually a destructive message. This sort of behaviour will ultimately end up in, well, the UK ending up as Charlie Parker ended up. I don't know.
It's a cautionary tale from 2014.
It is a cautionary tale.
It knew. It was like, in 2 years, the British public are going to need to watch this film and think on their decisions.
Well, 2014 was a Scottish referendum, so I guess it would have been contemporary as to then.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything to be drawn parallel. That what's drawing Andrew Neiman is jazz, which is American, and we've mentioned in analogies before that when the UK was looking at leaving the EU, that America was seen as the big ally, the big trade partner that we'd be fine with America. So maybe the jazz is intrinsically linked to America in that way.
Yeah, that's. Maybe, yeah.
It's a good point because it's a point that Paris made on a different episode of the podcast. So I guess you could relate it to Brexit, as we said. Independence for strength. Oh, it sounds a bit fascist when I put it that way. But
well, jazz is totalitarian,
as
maybe.
We've learned,
so it all links. So, question 11.
If we could put this in a different genre, what would it be?
Well, I want to come back to my previous point about, is this a film about jazz or is this a psychological thriller? I mean, if you changed the jazz element to anything else, would it work the same?
Okay.
And we were discussing this earlier. If you have the kind of teacher-student dynamic and the sort of obsessive skill development dynamic, it's kind of essentially the same thing. I mean, if you made it into ballet, you still get somebody bleeding a lot just from their feet. And
well, it's Black Swan, isn't it?
Basically just made Black Swan, but
or about I don't know, chess playing or violin playing
very
or something like
intense
that.
chess playing.
Remake the film as a StarCraft film in South Korea for competitive gaming.
Oh, for video games. Yeah, I'd love that, yeah. So you replace all the kind of practicing the instrument scenes with kind of getting better at the computer game.
You have an angry South Korean man screaming at his students saying, you're not on my tempo. To whatever you do on StarCraft. Of
course, and you're out of the team, there's competitions. Yeah, and I think the competitive element is key to what drives this film, because that's what really energizes the student-mentor relationship, is that idea of you can't mess this up. You have you have to perform. Yeah, so a StarCraft version would be great. Instead of, well, I guess you'd still have the same bloody hands, it only just be fingertips instead of...
all those finger cramps.
Yeah, gosh, and they got that distinctive mark on the bottom of the wrist.
Oh, that's where the yes ladder starts. You see the veins start on the arms, like the veins in Fletcher's head.
Yes.
And the finger cramps, and then the eye strain. It builds up.
Oh yeah, no, I really like seeing that. Actually, I think that could be a really cool concept. So we'd re-genre it to be essentially the same structure, but a different subject matter.
I'm just imagining the very iconic scene in Whiplash where Miles Teller's character, after his hand's cut open and is bleeding, puts his knuckle in ice water.
Plunges it into a bucket of ice.
In the StarCraft version, surely it'd be icy Mountain Dew.
Oh yeah,
puts his fists in, licks it off afterwards, and goes back to playing.
Yeah, I like it. Cool. So we'd kind of flipped the jazz element on its head. Instead of jazz, which is dying, apparently, according to the film, we place it in video games, which are up and coming. So we take that same dynamic, but plant it squarely in the 21st century.
They're hip.
Yeah.
The youth plays them.
Yeah, exactly. Are these the kind of, is that the kind of thing that the youth are fanatic and orgiastic about these days? Is that what the mass hypnosis is the...
I think
video
so.
Games.
If you've ever been to the main square on RuneScape, there's quite a lot of orgies happening there.
Well, there you go. So, video games are the new jazz. You heard it here first.
So, I think it might be time to move on to question 12 before we get too deep into whatever just happened.
Before we get on to question 12, do we have any other thoughts, any summarising thoughts before we...
I could talk a bit more about RuneScape orgies if you like.
No, I think that's quite enough.
Maybe not, mate.
I did just want to make one point, which is we've mentioned before that Fletcher has the tempo of the film, which translates to the editing of the film, the way it's cut, the way certain shots are edited and the cuts between shots is very Fletcher because he owns the time. Conversely, the camera in this film, I think, belongs to Andrew Neiman, because it only moves when he does. A lot of the film is static shots, conversations are shot, reverse shot, and lots of static cuts between close-ups of instruments. But when the camera moves from place to place, it's always following Andrew. And it's often quite shaky to represent his stress or his nervousness or whatever's going on. So I just thought that was interesting that Fletcher's the editor and Andrew's the cameraman.
Definitely. So anyway, question 12. Give this a more honest title. What do we think?
Ooh, what about A Moth to a Flame?
Oh, that's a good one.
Not quite my tempo, maybe.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's true with Fletcher showing such dominance over the beat and the tempo of the film.
There's definitely something to be said for distorted jazz history.
But how about something about totalitarian jazz?
Totally jazzy.
I mean...
No, that sounds far too jolly for this very dark film. Maybe something along the lines of sort of jazz dictatorship.
Okay.
Because jazz should be about democracy and individualism and improvisation. But in this, it's a dictatorship. Fletcher sets the tempo constantly.
Well, there's two things. You could call it Stop All the Clocks, which is W.H. Auden's satirical poem about a dictator who's just died, but is, of course, Stop All the Clocks about beat and time. Or you could call it Mein Krampf. You get like cramps in your hands if you do too much drum practicing.
I'm going to vote for Mein Krampf.
Okay, very nice. Charlie, any thoughts?
Minecraft is so good.
I don't know, man.
I can't beat Minecraft.
Well, I guess that's it. We're going to have to go for Whiplash, also known as Minecraft. All right, okay, I reckon that'll do it. Charlie, it's been great having you on the podcast this week.
Thank you for having me
so much. I gather there's something you might want to tell our listeners.
So hopefully by the time this podcast comes out, in the description of this video, or if not, I'll just comment somewhere from one of my many alternate accounts in the comment section that I use to argue with each other on all of your videos.
Nice.
So there should be a link somewhere to some writing that I'm doing myself, and you can be a Fletcher if you really like. You can tell me that it's not quite your tempo, but I would love it if anyone is interested, anyone needs some Christmas reading, I could just get some feedback on it.
Yeah, give it a read. Charlie's one of our great mates and a real smart cookie, so I'm looking forward to reading it myself. I think it's going to be a fantastic read. If you've enjoyed us talking on the podcast, then I'm sure you'll enjoy it as well. Right, well, until the next time, thank you very much for listening. I've been Jonny.
I've been Paris.
And I've been Charlie.
Bye!
Bye!